October 11th, 1942. Aboard the USS Helena, somewhere off the dark waters of Cape Esperance. The Pacific night is silent, black as ink, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's generators. In a cramped compartment below deck, a single man leans over a glowing green screen. His face is pale in the radar's ghostly light. Sweat beads on his temple. Outside, the sea is invisible. No moon, no stars, just darkness. But on that circular scope, faint, flickering, appear dots where none should be, echoes, moving. He adjusts the dial. Once, twice. The signal sharpens. Then his breath catches. "Captain, I think I've got something." Moments later, alarms shatter the quiet. The destroyer's guns rotate toward the unseen horizon. Shells arc through the black, guided not by searchlights, but by those silent, unseen pulses bouncing across the sea. For the first time in naval history, men are fighting enemies they cannot see and winning. But this moment, this revolution in the dark, began years earlier, with fear, with doubt, and with a handful of engineers who refused to sleep. It began long before the war ever reached the E2 Pacific. In the early 1930s, across quiet laboratories in Britain, Germany, and the United States, invisible battles of innovation were already underway. The question that obsessed a handful of physicists was simple. Could radio waves be used not just for communication, but to detect? To see the unseen? In Britain, engineers at Bawdsey Manor built tall steel towers along the coast. An early warning system known as Chain Home. Crude but powerful, it could spot incoming aircraft miles away, giving Britain what would later become its most vital shield. Across the Atlantic, the Americans watched with interest but little urgency. The U.S. Navy still trusted its eyes, lookouts, binoculars, and searchlights. Ships fought by what they could see, and night meant blindness. Yet the danger was growing. The 1930s saw new aircraft speeds, new submarines, and the rise of nations arming for conquest. In Germany, the FUMG radar network took form. In Japan, naval planners studied night attacks as a way to nullify the superior numbers of the U.S. fleet. Darkness was no longer just absence of light. It was a weapon. At the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory, NRL, in Washington, a young engineer named Dr. Robert Morris Page was quietly testing the impossible. In 1934, he built one of the first practical pulse radar systems in America, using radio pulses to bounce off a moving target and return a signal. It was crude, unstable, and fragile, but it worked. When a small plane flew over the Anacostia River Range, a blip appeared on his cathode ray tube. For a few seconds, invisible motion became visible. Still, Page and his team faced skepticism. Admirals dismissed radar as a laboratory curiosity. Funding was minimal. The Navy saw it as a supplement to radio, not a weapon of its own. The thought of navigating and fighting in total darkness seemed fanciful, until war loomed closer. By 1939, as Europe burned and the Pacific edged toward confrontation, whispers of radar's potential began spreading. The British shared limited insights under early scientific exchanges. The Americans responded with projects under the NRL and later the new MIT Radiation Laboratory. But it was still theory, still fragile, still unproven at sea. Naval combat, especially in the vast expanse of the Pacific, remained a contest of visibility. Whoever saw first struck first, and whoever struck first survived. That truth would soon force the U.S. Navy to see radar not as an experiment, but as salvation. When the sun rose over Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, it also illuminated the failure of vision. The U.S. Pacific fleet, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, was caught blind. The Japanese strike force had slipped undetected across thousands of miles of ocean. Ironically, an experimental radar station on Oahu had detected the incoming aircraft that morning, a massive signal on its screen. But the operators mistook it for friendly bombers from the mainland. Minutes later, explosions tore through battleship. Row. The Navy had learned, in fire and smoke, that human eyes were no longer enough. Within weeks, the scramble began. Engineers at the Naval Research Laboratory and the newly energized MIT Radiation Laboratory worked around the clock to adapt radar from land installations to ships and aircraft. The challenge was enormous. The ocean was not a laboratory. It was a moving, vibrating, salt-soaked world of interference and corrosion. Yet, the need was absolute. Dr. Robert Page's earlier prototypes evolved rapidly into the CXM radar, the first operational radar fitted to U.S. warships. By 1941, a handful of carriers and cruisers had it installed. Its rotating antenna looked ungainly, a skeletal frame perched atop the ship's mast, but it could detect planes over 50 miles away, even in darkness or fog. For the first time, the Navy could sense what it could not see. Then came the SG radar, smaller, sharper, and operating on microwave frequencies using the newly developed British cavity magnetron. The magnetron's concentrated power made radar more compact and accurate, capable of detecting a destroyer at sea with remarkable precision. Engineers from MIT's RAD Lab and NRL collaborated under crushing wartime secrecy, assembling devices in unmarked buildings and shipping them under armed guard to naval yards. Still, many officers remained cautious. Traditionalists preferred searchlights and binoculars. Radar was new, misunderstood, and at times unreliable. Early sets overheated, lost calibration, or produced phantom echoes. But the young radar operators, often engineers barely out of college, believed. They learned to read the ghostly patterns, to trust the flicker of light more than their own eyes. By mid-1942, as the Pacific War intensified, U.S. ships began sailing with radar-equipped bridges. The USS Helena, a sleek Brooklyn-class light cruiser, was one of them. Her operators drilled through endless nights, tracking friendly vessels and phantom echoes, refining a new kind of warfare, one fought not by light, but by reflection. What none of them knew was that soon, in the black waters near Guadalcanal, that glowing screen would change naval combat forever. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. No rifles, no medals, no heroic charges, just engineers, quiet, pale-faced men hunched over cathode ray tubes deep below deck. Life for a radar operator aboard a warship in 1942 was a paradox. They lived in darkness to see. Inside the cramped radar shack, a faint hum, and the steady sweep of a green beam became their world. Each echo that blinked onto the screen was a heartbeat, sometimes friendly, sometimes deadly. The men who mastered these signals often came from universities, and technical schools, rather, than the Naval Academy. Many were new to the sea, unfamiliar with its chaos. But, in them, the Navy found something it had never valued before. Minds wired for mathematics, electronics, and patience. They learned to interpret static, to hear meaning in noise. A single flicker could mean an incoming bomber, a ship's turn, or just a wave reflection. They developed instincts that bridged science and survival. On calm nights, they joked softly to stay awake. On tense ones, they barely breathed. It was lonely work. When the guns thundered, the radar shack shook, but their eyes never left the screen. They guided captains and gunnery officers who trusted them completely, or not at all. When the shells found their mark in total darkness, the credit went to the bridge. When they missed, suspicion turned to the strange new device below deck. Yet slowly, respect grew. The green light was no longer novelty. It was the Navy's secret weapon, and the men who served it knew they were watching the future being born, pulse by pulse. The SG radar was the Navy's quiet revolution. Compact, reliable, and astonishingly precise, it turned theory into lethal clarity. Operating in the S-band at around 3 GHz, the SG used a magnetron that emitted powerful microwave pulses. Unlike earlier radars that worked on longer wavelengths and gave vague, blurred returns, the SG's tight beam painted sharp echoes. Even small ships or coastline features could be tracked clearly. It was, in essence, an artificial eye that never blinked. Mounted on the ship's highest mast, the antenna rotated continuously, sweeping the ocean with invisible energy. The returning signals appeared as bright pips on a circular screen. Range rings showed distance. Bearing indicators gave direction. In trained hands, it was more than detection. It was navigation, gunnery, and survival. But it was delicate. Salt, air-corroded circuits. Power surges burned out valves. Operators constantly recalibrated the A-scope, balancing gain and signal strength. The slightest drift could turn an enemy cruiser into a phantom. Despite its fragility, the SG radar transformed naval tactics. No longer did ships have to rely on moonlight or star shells to engage at night. The radar operator became as vital as the lookout once was, his readings dictating when to turn, when to fire, when to live. And in the heat of war, this fragile brilliance would soon face its ultimate test, under enemy fire, in the blackest waters of the Pacific. Night used to belong to the enemy. Before radar, the Imperial Japanese Navy had mastered the art of darkness. Their destroyers moved like shadows, using spotlights only to illuminate targets before unleashing torpedoes that streaked unseen across the Black Sea. But in 1942, the balance began to shift. When the first American ships entered combat equipped with radar, particularly the SG and FC fire control systems, tactics changed almost overnight. No longer did commanders need to wait for moonlight or illumination shells to locate an adversary. A radar plot could track enemy movements long before visual contact, enabling the fleet to maneuver silently into position. Destroyers became the Navy's new predators. They learned to radar stalk enemy ships, approaching unseen, guided entirely by the operator's coordinates. For the first time, naval gunfire could be directed not by sight, but by numbers. Bearing, range, speed, all pulled from the glowing scope. In the chaos of Iron Bottom Sound near Guadalcanal, radar turned the tide. American cruisers that had once been ambushed began striking first. Torpedoes were evaded. Surprise was reversed. Radar had given the U.S. Navy what every admiral dreamed of: eyes that never closed. Yet this advantage came at a price: misinterpretation, overconfidence, and the lag in communication between the radar shack and the bridge often caused fatal confusion. At times, two friendly ships appeared as one target. At others, reflections from land or waves produced ghosts that vanished when chased. The technology was miraculous, but it demanded understanding, discipline, and absolute trust. At the start, few naval leaders grasped what radar truly meant. Admirals were men of vision, literal vision. They trusted binoculars and instinct, not invisible pulses. Some called radar a toy for scientists. Others feared it distracted from seamanship. Early demonstrations were met with polite applause, then indifference. Even when the first radar contacts proved accurate, commanders hesitated to act on them without visual confirmation. A hesitation that cost lives in the Pacific's early months. But the brutal lessons of Guadalcanal forced a change. The chaotic night battles there, Savo Island, Tassafaronga, Cape Esperance, revealed a truth even skeptics couldn't deny. The ships that trusted radar lived longer. The ones that didn't burned. Leaders like Admiral William Bull Halsey began to embrace the science. Radar became standard on flagship bridges. Dedicated combat information centers were created to process and interpret radar data in real time, a revolution in naval command that would shape fleets for generations. By late 1942, radar was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine. The Navy had entered a new dimension of warfare, where information, not eyesight, decided victory. For the Japanese Navy, radar was a mystery and a nightmare. Their early successes at night, built on years of training in optical, targeting and torpedo tactics, began to fail. Ships were struck before they ever sighted an enemy. Their gunners fired into empty water, blind to an opponent guided by unseen waves. Japan's own radar program lagged behind, plagued by limited resources, secrecy, and industrial strain. By the time effective sets like the Type 22 appeared, it was too late. The U.S. Navy had perfected integration between radar detection, fire control, and command. The Imperial Fleet, once master of the night, now fought ghosts, and in that darkness, in those few seconds when a flickering echo revealed a hidden armada. The future of naval warfare was sealed. The sea was black glass under a low, starless sky. Windless. Quiet. Too quiet. Off the northern coast of Guadalcanal, a Japanese task force slipped southward. 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and destroyers escorting transports bound to bombard Henderson Field. They moved without lights, confident in their mastery of night fighting. They had done it many times before, but this night would be different. Approaching from the west was Task Force 64, under Rear Admiral Norman Scott, a formation of U.S. cruisers and destroyers, including the USS Helena, Boise, Salt Lake City, and several destroyers. It was just before midnight. The Americans were sailing in darkness, radios silent, engines throttled low. But deep within the Helena's superstructure, the radar room glowed green. Inside, radar operator Ensign Joseph T. Bingham watched the rotating line sweep across his screen. Every 12 seconds, the antenna completed its rotation. Then, suddenly, faint blips. 1, 2, 3, moving fast. Multiple contacts, bearing 070, range 18,000 yards. The voice from the radar shack cut through the quiet of the Combat Information Center. Bingham's superior, Lieutenant Commander William McKnight, confirmed and passed the report to the bridge. Skepticism lingered. The captain of Helena hesitated. 18,000 yards meant more than 10 miles, beyond any visual sighting. But the radar echo persisted. The screen told the truth. Moments later, the ship's lookouts strained into the void. Nothing. No lights. No shadows. But the radar scope showed the Japanese column advancing, precise bearing, steady speed. Admiral Scott, aboard his flagship, received similar reports from other ships, each confirming the unseen contacts. This was the moment. For the first time, in naval warfare, radar was about to dictate the course of a night battle. At 23:46 hours, The Helena's radar-directed guns swung into alignment. Fire control linked range data directly to the targeting systems, a technical miracle achieved only weeks earlier. McKnight's voice was calm. Range confirmed. Bearing steady. Commence firing. The first salvo thundered across the water. Orange. Flashes split the night, followed by delayed thunderclaps echoing through the calm sea. The radar operator marked the blips scatter, returns breaking, splitting. The shells had found their mark. On the Japanese ships, chaos erupted. Caught completely off guard, their crews scrambled in the dark. Searchlights flickered on, revealing their own positions. American gunners, guided by radar corrections, adjusted fire instantly. Within minutes, the Japanese cruiser Furutaka was ablaze. Aboard the Helena, men could feel the heat of their own guns shaking the deck. Below, in the radar compartment, Bingham tracked targets with trembling fingers, calling out updates through the din. The once dismissed device was now the fleet's most vital organ, its eyes. The battle raged for less than an hour, but it changed everything. When the firing ceased, the sea burned with oil and debris. Several Japanese ships lay wrecked or retreating. The Americans, though battered and confused in formation, had struck first, decisively, guided by invisible sight. Above the shattered silence, the radar screens still glowed. Steady, calm, indifferent. The future of naval warfare had just appeared on their surface. When dawn broke over Cape Esperance, smoke drifted across the calm Pacific, glowing faintly in the rising light. The American fleet held its ground, battered, shaken, but victorious. For the first time in the Pacific War, a U.S. task force had won a night battle against the Imperial Japanese Navy. The secret? A few men in a dark compartment and a machine that could see. Reports began flowing through the fleet. Messages crackled. Over encrypted channels. Radar contact confirmed. Enemy intercepted and destroyed. For years, darkness had been the enemy. Now it had become an ally. Aboard the USS Helena, the realization settled slowly. The crew had fought without ever seeing their targets. They had fired into emptiness, trusting the ghostly glow of a radar scope more than the evidence of their own eyes. And it had worked. On nearby ships, the feeling was similar. Sailors gathered around the radar consoles that morning, watching. The faint echoes of retreating Japanese vessels fade into static. They understood that something fundamental had changed. Admiral Norman Scott, though modest in his after-action reports, acknowledged the unprecedented coordination radar had enabled. His cruisers had opened fire minutes before the Japanese even realized an enemy was present, a reversal of every Pacific night engagement up to that point. For Japan, the loss was more than material. It was psychological. Their doctrine of surprise and optical superiority had been shattered by a technology they barely understood. One Japanese survivor later described the experience. The enemy saw in the dark. They fired without light. It was as if they had eyes beyond nature. In Washington and Pearl Harbor, analysts pored over the battle's communications logs. The signals from Helena's SG radar were precise, reliable, and coordinated with fire control systems that translated invisible energy into lethal accuracy. This was no longer an experiment. It was the future. Soon after, the Navy began forming Combat Information Centers, CICs, on every major ship, dedicated nerve centers that integrated radar, sonar, and radio intelligence into one coordinated command. It was the birth of modern electronic warfare. Officers trained to interpret radar plots became invaluable. Exercises in night maneuvering turned into doctrine. Fleet manuals were rewritten to emphasize radar-directed gunnery and interception. And the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the birthplace of the SG, received orders to expand production to every vessel capable of carrying the system. The lessons of Cape Esperance echoed into the next great naval confrontations: Saadi, Canayurt, Guadalcanal, Kula, Gulf, Surigao Strait. In each, radar-guided tactics gave the U.S. Navy the initiative, turning darkness into dominance. But even victory carried unease. Many who had fought that night remembered the strange detachment of firing at targets they could not see, a kind of mechanical omniscience that felt both empowering and unnerving. War, once fought through human senses, was now filtered through circuits and cathode rays. The radar engineer aboard Helena, the one who first saw the flickering blips, was later asked what he thought in that moment. He said quietly, "It was like watching ghosts come alive, then disappear." By the end of 1942, radar was no longer a secret among the few. It was the Navy's heartbeat, pulsing silently through the Pacific, one revolution at a time. The night no longer hid the enemy. It revealed them, and from that night on, the ocean would never be truly dark again. In the months following Cape Esperance, the change was unstoppable. Every ship that left an American harbor now carried more than guns. It carried eyes. The SG radar became standard equipment across the fleet. Cruisers, destroyers, even landing craft began to mount the new rotating antennas that turned silently above the waves. Shipyards from San Francisco to Norfolk worked around the clock to install sets, train operators, and rewrite procedures. The once secret technology now defined the Navy's doctrine. Commanders who had doubted radar now demanded it. After action, reports from Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands told the same story. Ships with radar saw first, struck first, and survived. Those without it, or those who ignored its readings, did not. The Navy established radar schools across the United States, at Fleet Sound School Key West, Harvard University, and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to train hundreds of young sailors in the new science of detection. Many were barely 20 years old, plucked from civilian life, yet entrusted with devices that could decide battles. Radar operators became specialists, their role codified in naval operations. Every ship now had a combat information center, a dark, humming room filled with plotting boards, telephones, and glowing scopes. Inside, information flowed faster than ever before. Air raids tracked before visual contact, surface threats triangulated in seconds, torpedo attacks anticipated by range and bearing. The Pacific War transformed into a contest of electronics. Radar picket destroyers formed protective screens around carriers. Air search radars detected kamikaze attacks minutes before they appeared. Fire control systems evolved to link radar directly with gun turrets, allowing ships to engage unseen targets with devastating accuracy. By mid-1943, radar-equipped ships were not just fighting the Japanese, they were rewriting the rules of naval combat itself. Surprise attacks, once Japan's greatest strength, became nearly impossible. The enemy could not hide in clouds, smoke, or night. Every movement left a trace on a glowing scope. But with progress came complexity. Crews had to balance trust between man and machine. Radar could mislead, and errors at night could still turn deadly. The technology demanded discipline and constant calibration, a new kind of warfare that blended human intuition with electronic precision. For the engineers who had begun this journey in obscurity, the transformation was staggering. Their fragile prototypes, once dismissed as scientific curiosities, were now the guardians of fleets. The Navy had found its eyes in the dark, and they were made of glass, copper, and pulse. By the final years of the war, radar was everywhere, humming quietly in every corner of the Allied war machine. What began as a desperate invention now guided fleets across oceans, protected cities from bombers, and shaped every major battle from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In the Pacific theater, radar turned the tide of strategy. U.S. carrier groups, once vulnerable to surprise attack, could now detect enemy aircraft hundreds of miles away. Radar picket destroyers, small ships stationed on the perimeter of the fleet, served as sentinels, their screens glowing with the echoes of approaching formations. These pickets gave precious minutes of warning that saved carriers and lives. At Okinawa, that warning meant survival. Kamikaze attacks came in waves, but the pickets saw them first. Anti-aircraft fire filled the sky before the enemy could even see their targets. Radar had not only given vision, it had given foresight. For Japan, it was a nightmare realized. Their naval superiority, once rooted in stealth and precision, crumbled in the face of a weapon that turned invisibility into exposure. By 1944, captured Japanese officers spoke of radar with awe and resignation. One described it as the unseen eye of America. Back home, the psychological shift was immense. The Navy, once bound to the horizon, had transcended it. Commanders could now fight battles from within enclosed CICs, surrounded not by windows, but by glowing maps of moving light. The sea had become data. The enemy had become a signal, and yet victory carried a quiet melancholy. For those who had manned the scopes, radar's power was both wonder and burden. To destroy an enemy ship without ever seeing its crew, to fight an entire battle through electrical echoes, it was efficient, but also detached. Warfare had become abstract, precise, almost clinical. When the war ended, radar's influence did not. The same technology that guided ships through darkness soon guided planes across continents and monitored the skies for storms. Civilian engineers transformed it into air traffic control, meteorology, and even astronomy. In the Cold War years, radar became the watchtower of the atomic age, standing guard for threats that might come from beyond the atmosphere. And in the years that followed, the names of the men who built it, Page, Bingham, and countless others, faded into footnotes. Their invention, born of fear and necessity, had quietly reshaped the modern world. What began as a late-night discovery in a flickering room aboard a single cruiser had changed how humanity perceived distance, safety, and time itself. In the long silence after war, radar's hum did not fade. Its pulse continued, steady, unseen, echoing through the modern world. What began as a weapon of survival became a language of perception. It taught humanity to see beyond what eyes could bear, to trust the invisible. From storm tracking to air travel, from deep space probes to the quiet rotation of airport towers, the same pulse that once revealed enemy ships now keeps civilian lives safe every day. Yet behind its triumph lies a deeper truth, that human fear and ingenuity are inseparable. Radar was born not from curiosity alone, but from desperation. The need to see before being seen, to strike before being struck. Its legacy is not only technical, but moral, a reminder that progress often emerges from our darkest hours. For the men who first watched the glowing scopes aboard ships like the USS Helena, the memory never left them. They had witnessed the dawn of a new kind of warfare, Saganasa hunters, Fuar. One fought in silence, guided by invisible hands. And though the seas have long since calmed, the echoes remain. Every modern sensor, Every satellite, every flicker of a radar pulse across the sky carries within it that same late-night discovery. A young engineer staring into darkness and realizing, for the first time, that the unseen could be known. From that night in October 1942 onward, the Navy no longer feared the dark. Humanity had learned to see through it. From that night on, the darkness was never empty again.